Today, in this explainer, we aren't just looking at dates on a timeline or names of old battles. We are looking at a civilization that has already been judged by history. For centuries, the emperors of the Neo-Assyrian Empire absolutely believed their rule was as invincible as the mountains themselves. From their gleaming limestone walls, they looked down on a world they had literally submerged in absolute fear. But, as we're going to see today, that invincibility was just an illusion. The truth is much, much heavier. Because as modern historians brush away those final layers of ash, they've uncovered a pretty unsettling reality. This mighty empire was already rotting from the inside out, decades before a single enemy ever lit a torch at their gates. So let's examine this dark chapter together and uncover a warning that still echoes straight from the dust. I want you to imagine just standing in the dusty, windswept ruins of Nineveh. The afternoon sun is slanting through these shattered limestone reliefs, shining on the defaced statues of these once godlike kings, their faces completely gouged out by ancient axes. Actually, when you look at those defaced statues, you're forced to confront a really profound historical irony. At its absolute peak, this empire didn't die because they ran out of soldiers. There wasn't a shortage of bronze or iron. No, it died because the people standing at the very bottom, the actual foundation of the empire, well, they just stopped believing in the system. They looked up at those glittering palaces and essentially asked, why should we bleed to protect the thrones of the people who have stolen everything from us? Which brings us to part 1, the world of illusion. To the ancient world, Neo-Assyria was this terrifying, unstoppable machine, stretching all the way from the Persian Gulf up to Upper Egypt. They pioneered iron weaponry, right? And they transformed violence into this highly efficient, almost religious state industry. They built up this mesmerizing illusion of absolute power, convincing both themselves and their subjects that their dominance was just a permanent law of nature. And this quote here, etched into the intricate stone of the Southwest Palace, really reveals the sheer, calculated brutality behind that illusion. That's Emperor Ashurbanipal proudly recording his vengeance. You see, the Assyrian elite didn't just use cruelty in a sudden fit of rage. They used extreme, systematic terror as their main tool of statecraft. They honestly believed that by pushing ruthlessness to its absolute extreme, they could permanently extinguish the will of anyone to resist. But that philosophy ended up creating a blinding fog of arrogance. And that arrogance leads us to a fascinating mystery. Right beneath the ruins of the great royal library, which was, a place built to house the eternal glory of the empire, archaeologists found something that just didn't belong. It was a small, deformed clay tablet. It wasn't poetry. It definitely wasn't a record of tribute. It was hastily scribbled, full of panic, a desperate top-secret dispatch sent from the southern borderlands, right as the empire was collapsing. Now, I'm going to keep the contents of that terrifying message a mystery for just a moment, because to really understand what it meant, we first have to look beneath the surface of the empire itself. Let's uncover Section 2, the hidden layer, the rot underneath. So history often blames the fall of Assyria entirely on the strength of the invading Medes and Babylonians. But an empire with walls this high, it can't be shattered from the outside unless it is completely hollow on the inside. The truth is, the empire had become entirely parasitic. They weren't generating wealth for sustainable production. They were surviving almost completely on violent plunder and aggressively taxing their vassal states. War had essentially become this privatized, credit-based industry for the elite. Just look at the stark contrast. Up at the top you had this staggering influx of plundered gold, silver, resources, all hoarded completely by the generals, the royals, the high priests. But at the bottom, the reality for the common people was just tragic. Private financial records dug up at Nimrud show that average Assyrian farmers, who were literally the backbone of the military and the society, were being choked by predatory interest rates. We're talking 30 to 50% a year. The elite were so desperate to maintain their lavish lifestyles when outward expansion stalled that they turned inward. They literally started financially cannibalizing their own citizens. And as if that economic crushing wasn't enough, there was the human displacement. 4 million. Just think about that for a second. Over 4 million people were forcibly relocated across the territories by the Assyrian state. To put that into perspective, that is a massive, unprecedented shifting of human lives. Their strategy was cold and calculated. They wanted to tear communities away from their ancestral lands to break their spirit, right? To completely erase their patriotism. But they miscalculated terribly. By ripping these people from their homes and scattering them all over the empire, the rulers unwittingly planted millions of seeds of deep, furious resentment right inside their own borders. They effectively built a society made up of exiled victims who were just waiting for a spark. And then, the Earth itself seemed to turn against them. Modern paleoclimatologists looking at stalagmites in the Kunaba cave in northern Iraq found a really devastating piece of this puzzle. A brutal 60-year mega-drought. From 675 to 625 BCE, rainfall just plummeted. Now, this wasn't a sudden, traumatic event, but an agonizingly slow ecological collapse that completely choked the agriculture of Upper Mesopotamia. So think about those farmers we just talked about, already drowning in unpayable debt, now staring out at parched, cracked earth. Famine swept through the core of the empire. The land itself could literally no longer sustain the parasitic weight of the capital. Which leads us to Section 3, the deferred revelation, the gates open. So, remember that deformed clay tablet buried under the burning library I mentioned earlier? Well, it was a final, frantic dispatch sent to Emperor Sinshar-Ishkun, right as the invading armies were approaching the borders. And here is the horrifying truth written on it. The border guard wrote that the local troops had deserted, but worse than that, the displaced, relocated populations living at the borders had willingly thrown open the gates for the invading Babylonians. Read those words. They are no longer afraid of your sword. It's the tragic paradox of the iron sledgehammer. When a state relies completely on immense cruelty to maintain order, you eventually push people to a boundary where survival just means nothing anymore. The empire's extreme terror tactics had finally backfired. The fear evaporated, and all that was left was pure, unadulterated hatred. Section 4. The human consequence. Ordinary people abandoned. When we talk about 612 BCE and the fall of Nineveh, we really have to look past the collapsing grand architecture, We have to see the silent, desperate reality of the ordinary people. The people who were trapped inside those walls, utterly abandoned by the arrogant leadership that had just brought the wrath of the entire ancient world down on their heads. Hyperinflation is pretty much the ultimate metric of a society in total terminal breakdown. A starving citizen wandering the cold, empty marketplaces of Nineveh couldn't even trade a precious silver family heirloom for a single handful of barley. The trust in the currency, the trust in the community, the trust in the empire itself, it had all completely dissolved into the dust. It was just every family quietly starving in the dark, slowly realizing that their mighty protective walls were actually a prison. And honestly, nothing proves that grim realization more than the chilling archaeological discovery at the Halsey Gate. The grand, sprawling entrance to the city was found hastily bricked up with unbaked mud bricks. They had narrowed it down to a tiny, single-file crack, and surrounding this desperate modification were the tangled skeletons of over 100 people, killed by arrows and axes. The leadership was so paralyzed by terror that they literally bricked their own people inside to die as the walls crumbled around them. They sealed their own tomb, desperately trying to keep the consequences of their actions out. Finally, let's look at Section 5. The civilizational cycle, a warning from the dust. Let's pull back for a second and look at the broader picture here. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but power often blinds itself in the exact same way. When an elite class completely disconnects from the suffering of the earth and the people who actually work it, when they just chase this illusion of infinite expansion on paper while the actual foundation is rotting away, society eventually forces a brutal, inevitable reset. It's kind of like a heavy iron net being thrown over a field of green grass. Sure, it suppresses the earth for a long time, but eventually, the iron rusts, it snaps, and the grass grows back as if the iron was never even there. And after the violent collapse, an incredible thing happened. The surviving population didn't try to rebuild those massive oppressive palaces. Instead, they naturally, instinctively rejected the toxic weight of central control. For centuries after the fall, the people reverted to living in simple mud brick homes, tending small gardens, finding harmony with the land again. Humanity just shrugged off the empire. The earth took a breath again, finally free from the crushing demands of a system that had forgotten how to sustain life. We reach the end of our explainer today with this thought, a warning left behind in the dust of Nineveh. You see, the ultimate tragedy of the Neo-Assyrian Empire isn't just that they were conquered. It's the agonizing realization that their immense wealth and power became a blindfold. No system can endure when the prosperity of a few requires the brutalization of the many. In the end, empires rarely fall because they grow weak. They fall because they stop looking at the truth. Take a moment to let that sink in and ask yourself, what truths are we ignoring today?